Louisiana Eats is brought to you with major support from Zatarain's, a New Orleans tradition since 1889. From our studios in the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans, this is Louisiana Eats. I'm Poppy Tooker. The Catholic holiday of Mardi Gras has passed for this year, but right around the corner, Purim, the Jewish version of Carnival, is coming. On this week's Louisiana Eats, we'll learn about the Purim tradition from New Orleanian Benay Bernstein. And then Noah Rothbaum, food and drinks writer for the Daily Beast, gets the party started with a conversation about Jews and booze. Food writer Joan Nathan tells the story of Jewish peddlers along the Mississippi before Joyce Goldstein takes us on an exploration of the Mediterranean Jewish table. Get ready to shake your groggers. We're hosting a Purim party on this week's Louisiana Eats. Benay Bernstein was born in Brooklyn, but has called New Orleans home for over 30 years. Benay loves celebrating the festival of Purim. We spoke with her for an introduction to this holy day, one unlike any other on the Jewish calendar.
I'm just delighted to be here and to talk about our wonderful holiday, Purim. Purim is a true festive time, very much akin to Mardi Gras. We have dressing up in costume, people drink and eat and are merry because we're celebrating the fact that the Jewish people were once again saved. What happened was, before the Common Era, there was a town of Shushan, and King Ahasuerus and his wife, Queen Vashti, didn't get along, and he decided to get a new queen. And he had a big contest, and all the beauties of the land came, and he chose Queen Esther. Now, Esther was a Jewish young maiden, but he didn't know that. That was something you didn't make public. And Esther's guardian, Mordecai, worked around the court. One day, Mordecai overheard some plotting against the king, and he told the right authorities, and the plotters were apprehended. Mordecai had done a great deed on behalf of the king, but he was never rewarded for his good work until one night the king said, "Oh, Mordecai needs to be honored for saving my life." And he called his courtier Haman in. Haman is the villain of the story. And King Ahasuerus said, "Haman, what would you do to honor someone who has done good deeds for the king?" Haman thought it was himself. And he said, "Oh, this person should be dressed in royal finery and led through the town on the finest steed." And the king said to Haman, "Take Mordecai and lead him around the town because he saved my life." Haman was very unhappy and angry at this situation and decided to do in the Jews, and he encouraged the king to issue a proclamation that all Jews were to be killed on the 14th or the 15th, it varies in historical records, of Adar. Well, Mordecai got word to Esther that they're in great trouble, and Esther devised a plan to save the people. She asked the king to have 2 dinners, and at the second dinner, she said to the king, "Oh, my king, why do you wish to kill me?" "I don't wish to kill you," the king says. And she said, "But that's what's going to happen on the 14th of Adar." What he did is he issued another proclamation which allowed the Jews to fight back. So it's great. What a great holiday. We have war and we have villains, and the Jews fought back and they were able to end this rather shortly. There was some bloodshed and stuff, and everybody celebrates the saving of the people of Israel once again. Purim is celebrated both in the synagogue when the Megillah, which is the story of Purim, is read 2 times. It's read in the evening at the very beginning of the holiday, and then again in the synagogue on the following morning. Both times there's great festivity. During the reading, every time the villain's name, Haman, is mentioned, the children get to spin their groggers, noisemakers, and yell boo at the villain. And the children are encouraged to dress in costume, acting out the characters in the story. You could dress as the king or the good man, Mordecai. You could dress as Haman and wear his tri-cornered hat. And there's dozens of Queen Esthers. We have plenty of princesses these days. Those were the Queen Esthers of yore. And we celebrated another way as well. We have a community event called the Adliyadah, and that in this city and in many cities is celebrated in the Jewish Community Center. The center is decorated and the big hall is open up. There's all foods put out for people to eat and enjoy. The most important traditional food is Hamentaschen, which is actually a cookie, and it's delicious. Oftentimes we'll make them 2 batches at a time because the holiday has one other wonderful element. It's called Shalach Manas, which is sharing your bounty. You are to bring gifts of Hamentaschen and candies to your neighbors, your friends and neighbors during this holiday. In fact, every year my niece from Washington sends me Shalach Manas. She and her children get together, bake Hamentaschen, and send them to me.
New Orleanian Benay Bernstein, remarkable Jewish cook. Joan Nathan has shared her pursuit of the definitive DNA of Jewish cookery in her many books covering the global Jewish diaspora. Her search has taken her to countless places across the globe, including our own state. Joan joined us by phone to tell us what she discovered traveling up and down the Mississippi River in search of Louisiana's early Jewish settlers.
Louisiana put ads in newspapers in the 19th century in Europe, in Poland, in Germany, but mostly Alsace-Lorraine, so that many people would come from the same town, and they would come together as a family and develop the different towns. So I went to a lot of river towns, and I learned the same story in every town, that merchants came to the river in the 19th century. Goods were sold up and down the river. So first they would act as peddlers standing out into the countryside and selling their goods. And then, of course, when they got a little bit more money, they would build their homes and they would build stores right at the river, collecting the goods. With the advent of the automobile, people would go inward. And so these towns are beautiful, but they're basically left not just by the Jewish merchants, but other merchants. And, of course, malls have come into being and Walmarts, so that it's really changed. Donaldsonville is a perfect example.
What made Donaldsonville that perfect example?
Well, because it was on the water. Jews came as peddlers. They then owned many of the main grocery stores, the department stores on the main drag. Some of them, I think it was in St. Francisville, helped fund the public school, which is now a museum, a Jewish museum, part of it, and part of it's a cultural center. With a rabbi, I visited the graveyard, the Jewish graveyard. There were the Levies, Cohens, they're typical names, Jewish names. But what was so interesting is, Little Rock is far away. It's on a different river. But it was truly the same story.
Well, of course, all your research always leads back to the table.
Well, I knew what the Jewish food was that these people ate. And, of course, most of them are intermarried now. and are not in Louisiana. But the recipes that they brought with them would be matzo balls, but the real matzo balls with ginger and nutmeg, maybe with marrow in them. I think Manischewitz called them Alsatian feathery balls. They didn't use the word matzo balls. Could be made with bread or with matzah. They also ate a lot of tongue. They would eat quiches, beignets. And what was fascinating to me in doing this research and going around, I started thinking about Marcel Proust. His mother was Alsatian Jewish. And then I remember when I went to Café du Monde, they had beignets. You can see they're cut with a knife. That's exactly what Alsatian donuts that people ate for Hanukkah or Purim would have been, that the Jews would have eaten. So that you don't know if Jews brought them or just Alsatians, because there were a lot of Alsatians. But the point is that this was a regional dish that was brought by Alsatians. Oh, and I know the other thing is kugel, the kinds of kugels that they brought with them. When I was in Alsace, I kept thinking about the first time I went to Commander's Palace and the bread puddings. That's what they really were bread puddings.
Mm.
And they might have had prunes in them and dried pears and cooked a long time, but sort of sweet, but not too sweet.
Mm-hmm.
And all I could think of was, you're eating this as a side course, but it sure could be a dessert in Louisiana.
It's very interesting because then what I'm hearing is that you witness sort of the evolution of these old dishes into things that now people think are classics from here.
Well, that's the way food travels, you know. That's why I think it's so important to be in a place. But the problem is today, in a lot of these little towns, it's very hard to find what was. You know, in a lot of these towns, everybody's trying to be sort of upscale, and you very often have to go into homes, and there aren't any Jews that live there anymore. So in some ways, what I've done is found Jews from Donaldsonville that live in Washington, D.C. You've got to dig to get them.
Award-winning food writer, Joan Nathan. Coming up next, we explore Afro-American Judaic roots with food historian Michael Twitty. Louisiana Eats returns in a moment. I'm Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Louisiana Eats is brought to you with major support from Rouse's Markets, from Camellia Brand, Beans Done Right, a New Orleans tradition since 1923, and also from Brennan's Restaurant. Breakfast at Brennan's, featuring Chef Slade Rushing's updated classic Creole cuisine. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and private events at 417 Royal Street in the historic French Quarter. Are you podcasting Louisiana Eats yet? If not, it's time to subscribe. We've launched a new podcast series, Louisiana Eats Quick Bites. Quick Bites combine previously unaired interviews with lots of info and recipes, too. This week, we're launching Quick Bites Uncensored with an expurgated Donald Link, never allowed to be broadcast before.
You gotta think, I was 27 years old at the time. I was like, I remember standing up to this one cook. It was like this big. I'm like, if you don't like it, get the out. There's a door right there.
You don't want to miss this. So subscribe today on our podcast page at poppytooker.com. That way, you won't miss a single serving of our broadcast or our new Quick Bites podcast. And now, back to Louisiana Eats. Michael Twitty is a writer, culinary historian, and historical interpreter. He's dedicated to preserving and promoting African American foodways, always with an eye on authentic African origins. Michael is also a Judaic studies teacher in Washington, D.C. When we spoke, I asked him to take us along on the voyage that led to his Orthodox conversion to Judaism in his 20s.
Well, when I was about 7 years old, I grew up with my feet in many different places, one of which was a neighborhood in the Washington, D.C. area called Kent Mill. And Kent Mill now, even more so, is basically an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. And I grew up on the edge of that neighborhood, and you played in the sukkah, in the fall. And all that got into me somehow. When I was 7 years old, I told my mother I was Jewish. And my mother thought that was really odd. But she let me be Jewish for a week. And it ended abruptly when I was told that I had to go to the doctor's office for a certain operation. Oh yeah, my mother knew how to pull all the stuff.
What was your original faith?
Well, I grew up in a nominally Christian household. Neither one of my parents at that time in the game was really that church-going, that religious, and my grandmother was far more spiritually Christian than anything else. She certainly believed in what I call the old religion, which y'all have a lot of down in New Orleans.
Yes, we do. So what happened to bring you back to that 7-year-old wanting to be Jewish, Michael?
I never really lost that interest. And I describe it as more of someone who just kind of shifts their place, as opposed to someone who just makes a leap. I did imbibe a lot of the black church growing up. But later on, when I was more in college and I did a lot of programs with black-Jewish relations, I knew this stuff. I knew so much stuff that we would go on synagogue visits. They would ask me, "Are you sure you're not Jewish?" And I said, "No, I'm sure I'm not Jewish." But wait a minute, but and that it's very funny how insider cultural knowledge, often people assume you got to be that thing, that person, that identity, to know so much. But it came down to a point where I just kind of felt uncomfortable not being involved in the cycle of holidays. I studied so much that it began to become a part of me in a way that I had not anticipated, that I did not really understand. So I was working with the Smithsonian Folklife Festival for the Washington, D.C. program in 2000. And I talked to my professor from AU. I was doing classes at American University in Jewish Studies. And she said, "Sure, I'll introduce you to Joan Nathan."
Oh, Joan Nathan, our mutual friend.
Big part of the story. And I went over to Joan Nathan's house. She lives in D.C., and we talked. She taught me how to make a challah recipe she just brought back from Israel, which is the best challah in the world, by the way. And we talked, and I said, "Can we talk to a Sephardic rabbi?" She said, "Sure, I'll connect you." So lily pad to lily pad, I ended up at the synagogue where I converted, which is the Magen David Sephardic congregation.
So that's really where you find the African strain of Judaism in the Sephardic concentration of the religion?
It's much closer. Thinking that there were African Jewish communities into what is now Mali and northern Nigeria and other parts of West Africa, all of whom probably originated somewhere in Morocco and North Africa, and everywhere these people went, eventually you ended up looking like people you settled among. That's a big part of it. But also there's Ethiopia, there's the people who live in southern Africa who have no connection to anybody but the Jews from Yemen. So there's this incredible sort of sense there are people of color who are Jewish all over that, many of these communities predated the communities in Poland and Russia by a long shot. But it's even more salient to me because you go to Cuba, there are black Jews in Cuba, in Brazil, in corners of the world you never thought. I was looking through a catalog, as it were, of free black families in antebellum Charleston. You would not believe how many of them had the last name Levy or Cohen.
Wow. That is really fascinating. And were some of the black Jews also enslaved peoples?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, no doubt about it. In fact, there's one document from the very beginning of the transatlantic slave trade that talks about how a lot of the communities in what is now the Sahel region of West Africa were eradicated and sold into slavery.
Wow.
That's for real.
This is such a fascinating story, and the analogy that you make about the history of African Jews being braided together just like the challah, it's so evocative.
Well, I mean, it's two parts of a whole. I call it blending tones. You know, how do we survive? How do we survive using humor, using food, using spirit, using the will to overcome, as opposed to fusing? You know, when we fuse stuff, it's almost kitschy, it's almost funny, it's almost corny.
Mm-hmm.
When we mix the tones together, that's when we get the deeper meaning of who we are.
Let's explore this Judaic part of your story a little further and move on to another piece of the puzzle that you call kosher soul, which also, by the way, is your Twitter handle. So what do those words really represent when you put them together?
Well, it's kind of like one way of branding one part of my identity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of like more than one person in one being, and that part of my identity is when those tones mix. It's a way of saying that the symbolism and meaning and deep value that Judaism and Jewish learning play in my life meets the soul element, the soul tradition, the soul people, and just the kind of the African aesthetic that I grew up with. You know, I am that guy who will walk around the streets of Manhattan with an Obama kippah, a cowrie shell ring, and a bowl of cotton in his lapel. That's me. That's just me. You get what you get. It's fun because it's living into your authentic self.
Yes.
And so when it comes to the plate, I guess here's the best way to say it. The food that I put out in my own personal circle and setting is an invitation to this complex identity we've been talking about. If people cannot understand or comprehend me on any other level, they can understand me through my plate. I've really focused my energy on very well-known West African proverb, sit at my table and you shall know me.
That's beautiful. And really and truly, food is the international language. So tell me, what do you serve? What's on that plate?
Well, this will make you happy. I am not a sufganiyot, a jelly donut person. I do beignets.
You do beignets.
Fried donut, yes.
According to our friend Joan, those beignets are very closely tied with the Jews from Alsace-Lorraine.
And that's very exciting because I didn't know when I was down there, the Cafe du Monde was kosher certified as well. And I was introduced to them by a friend of the family. She was from Louisiana, and she brought a box back to my mother. My mother said, I don't know what to do with this. So she handed it to me. This was when I was a teenager.
Uh-huh.
And I just mixed them up and did all that, and I've since learned how to make them from scratch, and I just thought, this is perfect. It's cooked in oil. It's Southern. You can cook it up. It warms you up in the cold. It's just a really good match. But I also make a West African-style brisket.
And what goes into that?
The Trinity goes into that with a lot of hot pepper, a lot of tomato, a lot of green pepper, green onion, the whole deal. But also, you know, I rub it down with a spice mixture that's classic Nigerian called suya, which is kind of like berbere in Ethiopia or curry traditions in India. It's a really good meat spice mixture that you kind of like rub and let sit on the meat, and you can grill it or you can slow bake it. And I do a little bit of both. I kind of par grill it and then I let it sit around for a while. Everybody gets what they want.
African-American Judaic writer and culinary historian Michael Twitty.
I'm Noah Rothbaum. I'm the drink and food editor for the Daily Beast and also the author of The Art of American Whiskey.
Noah Rothbaum has exhaustively researched the cultural significance of whiskey in America. Now he's studying a spirited history that hits closer to home. In a series he calls Jews and Booze, Noah has charted the migration of Jewish people from several old countries to the Americas, with an eye on the role the Jews have played in popularizing distilled spirits. Noah stopped by our studio to share his findings.
It's one of these topics where at first glance it sounds like a seminar on maybe Jews and sports, which would be pretty easy, to cover with just a few Hank Greenberg and maybe a few other Sid Luckman, and then we'd be pretty much done, right? But in fact, Jews and booze, the history goes back, really a very long time. And, as I started looking into it, I realized just how important Jews have been in the evolution and the manufacture of alcohol around the world, and how in many ways they've been written out of history and sort of been replaced by what at least in American whiskey, what I like to call the Uncle Jesse phenomenon from Dukes of Hazzard. This idea that people in Appalachia and rural, communities in America, were the ones who created American whiskey. And in fact, it was probably more like Uncle Vanya from, Russia or Poland who are making, the American whiskey at its beginning. The first start off is the fact that because of the laws of kashrut, the dietary laws for observing Jews have to make their own wine and whiskey, or at least it has to be certified kosher, right? And there are a number of organizations that do that today. And as a result, Jews have, at least since the rabbinic period, and I guess about the 1400s, Jews have made wine and spirits. And in Poland and Russia, part of it was that the manufacture or sale of alcohol was often connected to taxation, which were occupations that Gentiles didn't want to do or were prevented from doing. And there were a lot of, these myths about Jews, that Jews didn't drink, and that, that would make them the sort of perfect people to run liquor stores and make drinks. And, you get all of these cycles of, pogroms, anti-Semitism, where, Jews are, allowed to do these things, and then, then they're forced out of these businesses, and they're bootlegging with sort of Gentile fronts, where they're the face of the business was really Jews. And then ultimately, it gets so bad that, people flee. Unfortunately, there is a place in America to come. And when they come to America, they have this amazing distilling knowledge.
Listening to Noah, it struck me how much research it took to draw out these narratives. So I asked him to share a few specific stories about prominent Jewish distillers.
One of the perfect examples is somebody, I.W. Bernheim, Isaac Wolf Bernheim, who started I.W. Harper, which became really the most popular American whiskey brand before Prohibition. He comes from Germany. He has very little money. He goes to Paducah, Kentucky, where he has some family. He had some experience working in a distillery back home. He begins working, in the alcohol business, is successful. He sends for his brother. His brother comes. They start their own distillery. He chooses, interestingly enough, to keep the first two initials of his name, but instead of calling the brand Bernheim, he calls it Harper, which, there are different theories, but it may have been the name of his favorite horse trainer, but obviously it sounds a lot more Gentile.
Yes.
Bernheim's name during his lifetime never appears on a label. Only later Heaven Hill, in recent times comes out with a Bernheim whiskey, and they name their distillery Bernheim to honor him. His story is a very common one. And before Prohibition, you get an astounding number of people, even though they make up a very small percentage of the population in places like Louisville, Kentucky, like 3% or something, but a huge number of them are in the liquor business, and they're really dominating the liquor business, in places like Louisville and Cincinnati. And it really becomes almost synonymous with Jews.
The Jewish distiller diaspora reached some surprising places. Noah told us about one notable family, the Bronfmans, who fled the pogroms of Eastern Europe and ended up north of the border.
They land in Canada. They're involved in a lot of different businesses. They, find their way into the booze business. They buy the very, waspy Seagrams. And as time goes by, the Bronfmans start to clean up their own history, like kind of leaving out the Bessarabia part, kind of saying that they're Canadians, Then on the other side, you have Louis Rosenstiel, who's running Schenley, right? I mean, he's Jew as well. They're rivals. He's also Sidney Frank's father-in-law, Sidney Frank, who created Grey Goose and Jägermeister. I mean, those are the two largest spirit companies in the world are run by Jews or Jewish families at that point. And then also Jim Beam, after Prohibition, Jim Beam, the Beam family, they lose the right to their intellectual property of their original brand, which was called Old Tub. During Prohibition, the Beams try their hand at a lot of different businesses to try to stay solvent, right? Because they can't make alcohol. So once Prohibition is done, they want to open up a distillery, but they don't have the money. So they turn to four investors in the Chicago area. Ultimately, one of them is the Blum family, also Jews. They ultimately buy out their partners right before World War II. So up until the late 60s, Jim Beam is owned by a Jewish Chicago family. Heaven Hill, the Shapiras, who are still going strong and own, Heaven Hill, or as they say down in Kentucky, the Shapiras, they trace their lineage back to Max L. Shapira, who was an immigrant from Lithuania. So, I mean, really, you have all of these companies are run by Jews.
There were even Jewish liquor businesses here in Louisiana. At least one is still going strong.
You have somebody like Bill Goldring, and one of the wealthiest men in Louisiana, who owns Buffalo Trace Sazerac, which has turned into an amazing corporation. But even Sazerac Buffalo Trace, up until recently, didn't really want to talk about Bill Goldring and the fact, that they had Jewish roots. It wasn't, he was kind of a silent owner. I mean, for the most part, I think we forget that it was really hard for Jews in America, and they had to work really hard to assimilate and sell products. And a product that had the name I.W. Bernheim probably would not have sold like a product that had a name I.W. Harper. I think there's a reason Ralph Lauren calls himself Ralph Lauren and not Ralph Lipschitz, and that just as he created Polo, which almost imagines a whole world for wasps that perhaps didn't exist, and just as the Daryl Zanucks and the Louis B. Mayers of Hollywood create all these golden age films about the Golden Medina, what they as an immigrant imagined America would be. Obviously, when they came here, found it was not like that, but created movies that portrayed aspects of what they wanted, and America turns into that because people are watching these movies. I think in some way, Jews with these liquor brands had to find a way to sell their products, get into business, create a world where they could use these skills that they had from the old country and reinvent themselves for America.
Of course, as with many immigrant stories, everything that comes out of the melting pot is not perfect. As Jewish people began to arrive in the U.S., stereotypes emerged around Jews and booze.
I mean, I think there's a wide-held myth, right, that Jews don't drink. In a lot of these communities, Jews were the outsider, right? So it wasn't as socially acceptable, or they weren't accepted at the club or the bar.
Or perhaps even at the distillery. Anti-Semitism is part of this story, but Noah believes that Jews also stayed out of the liquor limelight because of the stigma attached to it.
The stench of Prohibition and the corruption and all of the terrible things that happened during Prohibition lingers really up until probably 20 years ago. And I think part of it was that a lot of the people involved in these businesses it might have been sort of unsavory to say that you were involved in the liquor business. And they might not have wanted to be known, as the owner of a large liquor business.
Eventually, the shadow of Prohibition receded, and Noah points out that today, Jewish distillers and distributors are once again carving out a space for themselves in the industry.
In fact, we see now a new generation of of Jews in America who are starting their own distilleries. There's one even in San Francisco, 209, that for Passover makes a special gin and vodka that's made from a sugarcane base, and there's a giant OUP on the front. So clearly now people are realizing that this is almost an asset, that they're rediscovering this and using this as a selling point.
Noah Rothbaum, drink and food editor at the Daily Beast. What are Hamentaschen, and what do they have to do with the festival of Purim? Stay tuned, and we'll tell you all about it when we come right back. Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Louisiana Eats is brought to you with major support from Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen, Zatarain's, and from French Market Coffee. French Market Coffee's premium blended beans are locally roasted in small batches, creating a coffee that can only be called New Orleans bold. Here's this week's culinary quiz question, brought to you with support from Popeye's Louisiana Culinary Institute. What are Hamentaschen, and what do they have to do with the festival of Purim? Hamentaschen are triangular-shaped short cookies, most often filled with poppy seeds that are eaten and given as gifts during the Purim holiday. As we learned earlier from Benay Bernstein, as told in the book of Esther, Haman was the villain. Some say the cookies represent Haman's pockets filled with dough, hard cold cash that is, that he offered as blood money for permission to destroy the Jews. Other scholars point out that the triangular-shaped cookies represent the Babylonian dice thrown by Haman to determine the date of the Jews' destruction. Pretty grim tale to tie to a cookie, huh? Trust me, one bite of a Hamentaschen will dispel all sad thoughts and just make you want to get out that old grogger again. I'm Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to Louisiana Eats. When we think about Jewish food, most of what comes to mind could fill a deli counter on the Lower East Side. Open Joyce Goldstein's cookbook, The New Mediterranean Jewish Table, and you'll find something quite different. Across the globe, the Jewish diaspora created a cuisine that encompasses a wide diversity of flavors. In compiling her book, Joyce set out to demystify Jewish cooking of the Mediterranean region. To begin, she addressed some of the common misconceptions people have about modern Jewish food.
See, most of the Jews that came to the United States came from Eastern Europe. They were the Ashkenazi Jews. And they settled on the East Coast, which is sort of media central. And the image that was projected is with blintzes and borscht and bagels and, kugel and brisket. And so in the average person's mind, when you say Jewish food, they think bagels and lox or brisket. And it disregards this entire huge community of Jews from other parts of the world. But see, very few Mediterranean Jews came to this country. So I guess I would like people to realize that Jewish food is a huge vocabulary of recipes from other countries, but largely vegetable-based, and a much better and much more diverse diet.
I learned so much whenever I read one of your books, and I think it is fascinating that all these years later, you've come back to this topic because I think there have been possibly cultural food shifts, and there's ingredients that weren't available when you first started writing the books.
Absolutely true.
Tell me how you decided it was time for another book on this topic.
Well, I had been working with University of California Press, and we had just done Inside the California Food Revolution, and I enjoyed very much working with them, even though that book was probably the hardest book I've ever done in my life. And they said they would like to do a Jewish book, but sort of focusing on just the food of the Mediterranean Jews, because most of the Jewish cookbooks that are written are Ashkenazi food, or, modern takes on Ashkenazi food, and the market is saturated. And we felt that not enough attention had been placed on the much healthier Mediterranean diet and the food of the Mediterranean Jews. So that's where we began, and I realized that in all the work I had done before, I hadn't really concentrated as much on the Jews that grew up in Muslim countries, all the center part of the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, all of those countries, and Iran. We had mostly focused on the more famous countries of the Mediterranean, Greece and Turkey, Italy, Spain, Portugal. And with all these Israeli chefs and Israeli cookbooks, there's a renewed interest in food from this part of the world. So it's sort of ironic that Israeli chefs are the ones that are bringing attention back to the food of the Mediterranean Jews.
I'm wondering if you could sort of walk us through the various spices and flavorings that define all of these different varieties of Jewish food and the people who cook it.
Okay, well, it's a very interesting story. If you look at Spain and Portugal, paprika, garlic, always lemon, always olive oil, a few herbs, but it's basically a fairly neutral cuisine. Some cinnamon in the sweets. When you get to Italy, again, it's basil and parsley and a little nutmeg and a little cinnamon, but also pretty subdued. The Italians are not sitting around eating spicy Jewish food. Then you get to North Africa, and it's like a riot of all the different spices. I mean, between the charmoulas and the harissas and the preserved lemon and the caraway, coriander, cumin, it's everything. Yet when you get to other parts of the Middle East, Greece and Turkey, you get the cinnamon tomato dynamic in Greece and the use of dill and mint. And Turkey maybe picks up a little bit on the allspice, but again, a little more subdued. And then you get to the Arab countries, the Mizrahi Jews, and some have some spices in it, but again, a more balanced palette of spices and herbs, and the introduction of ingredients like sumac and tahini, and the fruits of the quince, the figs, the dates, all of those sort of sweet and sour. And a lot of this comes from Iran. I mean, that whole sweet, sour fruit with meat thing started in Iran, made its way into North Africa, sort of through Morocco, and then up into Catalan Spain, and then over to Turkey. So it's formed a whole circle. It's sort of interesting that a good idea, a good flavor idea, has made its way all the way around the Med.
It's very fascinating to me that whole transverse of countries and cultures. And as I understand it, one of the things you were doing was actually working with old recipes that said crazy things that 21st century cooks can't possibly translate, like an eggshell of this
or a mustard glass or some weird measurement. No, I mean, you became sort of a detective tracing these recipes and cooking them and trying to figure out what they meant. I mean, sometimes they'd say fold in the usual manner. Well, if you weren't there in that kitchen, who knows? So it really was a lot of trial and error, a lot of recipe testing, and then putting in the context of the modern palate, because today Americans want food that's a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more intense in flavor. And I think that when I was cooking these recipes, sometimes I'd say, man, I better increase the lemon juice, or, I'd cook it for my family or friends. It's great, but it needs something. There's always it needs something, and often it was a squeeze of lemon or a little bit more heat or up the spices.
I love the fact that you've got a whole chapter about savory pastries in particular. And you mentioned that you're concerned that handmade pastries are endangered. You want to tell me about that?
Well, yeah. In the old days, women did not go to work, so they had all day to cook. And housing was very communal. Families lived together. They'd sometimes gather in a courtyard and sit around a table and do a lot of work together. In Algeria, I was reading about a family where the entire block made matzah for Passover together and did it each day so that each family had enough matzah to get through the holidays. So a lot of these women, there was no rush. No one had to go to soccer practice at 10 o'clock or whatever. They could cook all day and sit around the table and fold these little pastries and, take their time. And now it's very lonely to sit and do a lot of these things by yourself. No, the high point of the day was standing around the table with other cooks, tasting food and saying, all right, do we like it this way? What does it need? We want all to be in agreement so that when we serve this dish, this is our signature. And I love tasting with other people. And even now when I cook with my family, I'll say, will somebody taste this, please? Am I on the right track? Do you like it? Is this right? Because there's something about tasting communally that's a beautiful thing to do.
Joyce Goldstein, author of The New Mediterranean Jewish Table. That's it for this week's edition of Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Have you missed an episode of Louisiana Eats? Hear today's show or catch up on previous editions anytime online at itsneworleans.com. If you're not podcasting yet, it's time to subscribe. We've launched a new podcast series, Louisiana Eats Quick Bites. The podcasts combine new material not yet aired on Louisiana Eats with lots of food history and recipes, too. Our latest is Donald Link Uncensored. Trust me, you don't want to miss this.
The first week was rough, and Susan had to pull me aside. I'm like, look, everyone thinks you're kind of a need to settle down a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
That's what John said later. He goes, yeah, you were a but you know what? You could back it up.
Visit our podcast page at poppytooker.com and don't miss a single serving of our broadcast or our new podcast. Louisiana Eats is made possible with major support from Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen, Zatarain's, French Market Coffee, Camellia Beans, and Rouse's Markets. Additional support for Louisiana Eats is provided by the Shreveport-Bossier Convention and Tourist Bureau and from Dickie Brennan's Steakhouse, a local New Orleans steakhouse serving prime beef and Louisiana Wagyu in New Orleans, French Quarter. Original theme music by Johnny Sketch and the Dirty Notes. Big thanks to producers Joe Schreiner, Reggie Morris, and especially to our Jewish authority on staff, producer Sarah Esther Holtz. Special thanks also go to our business manager and social media maven, Maddie Mullidew. Come visit us anytime in our Louisiana Eats studios at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. Don't forget to find our recipes and see what we're up to at poppytooker.com. You can check us out on Facebook and Instagram, too. I'm Poppy Tooker. Louisiana Eats is a production of Poppy Tooker Broadcasting.